As a starting point, we shall make a first, rather traditional, reading of Ricci's life by focusing on the missionary himself. Of course, during the Ming dynasty many European missionaries came to the Middle Kingdom, but they were allowed only to Macau. Hence we can conclude how difficult it was for Matteo Ricci to obtain a visa for China. His task of spreading Christianity was even more difficult in a country where Confucianism dominated and Buddhism was also deeply rooted. Ricci was one of the first promoters of Catholicism in China, and even today he is revered there for his role as a bridge of culture between China and the West. The contact between China and Europe goes back thousands of years, and the 16th century arrival of the Jesuits was certainly not the first Western visit in this amazing country. In the Middle Ages, Europeans, Persians and Arabs traveled across the famous Silk Road, and many of them were so fond of China that took up permanent residence there. During the 13th century reign of the Mongol Kublai Khan over China, Franciscan missionaries from the west had followed the Venetian trader Marco Polo to Cathay. They established close contacts with the ruling Khan and the Chinese population, but have made little attempt to learn the Chinese classics. Actually, they appear to have been primarily a foreign mission, serving Europeans who came in following the Mongol conquest. With the end of the Mongol reign, the mission collapsed without a trace. Matteo Ricci arrived in the Middle Kingdom in 1581, and developed the policies that guided the mission through the next 2 centuries. What he discovered there was totally unlike the conditions that prevailed in the Americas, Africa, or India at the time. The Jesuits' reports to Europe described a country with a civilization surpassing in many respects that of the West, and with a greater knowledge of its own antiquity. A century later, Europe's greatest philosopher, scientist, and statesman, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, reflecting on the reports from Ricci and those who followed him, reported, "There is in China in certain regards an admirable public morality conjoined to a philosophical doctrine, or rather a doctrine of natural theology, venerable by its antiquity, established and authorized for about 3,000 years, long before the philosophy of the Greeks." The Jesuits' lead policy of accommodation or adaptation to Chinese culture, probably inspired by the Japanese missions, Ruggieri and Ricci entered the mainland in 1682 and 1683 through the south, dressed like Buddhist monks. Not long after, they realized that the only way to dissociate themselves from the Buddhist monks, who were considered to be very low on the social ladder, was to turn to Confucianism. In 1595, after nearly 15 years of experience, they changed this policy and adapted themselves to the lifestyle and etiquette of the Confucian elite of literati and officials. Ricci was responsible for this change. This new policy remained unchanged throughout the whole 17th century, and for most Jesuit missionaries, Matteo Ricci became the reference point with regard to the accommodation policy. Jesuits addressed themselves to the literate elite. They carried out indirect propagation of the faith by using European science and technology in order to attract the attention of the educated Chinese and convince them of the high level of European civilization. Ricci introduced paintings, which impressed the Chinese with their use of perspective, translated mathematical writings of Euclid with the commentaries of the famous Jesuit mathematician Clavius, and printed an enormous global map which integrated the results of the latest world explorations. By these activities he established friendly relationships with Confucian literati such as Gutai Su, which sometimes resulted in the conversion of members of the elite. Ricci's method required openness to and tolerance of Chinese values. In China, Matteo Ricci encountered a society with high moral values, for which he expressed his admiration. Educated in the best Jesuit humanistic tradition, he favorably compared Confucius 552–479 BC, with another Seneca and the Confucians with a sect of Epicureans, not in name, but in their laws and opinions. Ricci was of the opinion that the excellent ethical and social doctrine of Confucianism should be complemented with the metaphysical ideas of Christianity. However, he rejected Buddhism, Taoism, and Neo-Confucianism, which in his eyes was corrupted by Buddhism. Ricci pleaded for a return to original Confucianism, which he considered to be a philosophy based on natural law. In his opinion, it contained the idea of God. Ricci quickly realized that Confucianism was not exactly a religion in the Western sense, but a socio-political system and moral doctrine, more like a scholarly source of the administrative structure, which existed for the good of society. For 20 years Matteo Ricci had tried to reach the emperor in person, but the Son of Heaven was a recluse, not accustomed to seeing even his own people. An opportunity was occasioned by an eclipse of the sun. The prediction of the expected time and duration made by the Chinese astronomers differed considerably from the Jesuit prediction. When the latter prediction proved correct, the place of the Jesuit mathematicians was secure. Eventually Ricci was welcomed to the academies and gained many influential friendships. He managed to open a scientific residence in Anjing for himself and his fellow Jesuits. Later he became the court mathematician in Beijing. In 1584 and 1600 he published the first maps of China ever available to the West, and for the first time the Chinese had an idea of the distribution of oceans and land masses. Ricci also translated the primary Chinese classics into Latin, and wrote several tracts in Chinese that won him great respect and fame among the literati. These included a dialogue between a Western scholar and a Chinese scholar, called The True Idea of the Lord of Heaven, and several translations of Euclid's Elements and Scientific Studies. Ricci believed that his knowledge of Renaissance science was inseparable from his knowledge of the Christian faith. He insisted that the leap in scientific progress in Renaissance Europe was not a secret of the West, but was the patrimony of all mankind. Ricci of course had to dress in the style of a Chinese scholar and be known under a Chinese name, Li Matu, to become accepted by the Chinese. However, he became famous in China for more than his mathematical skills, renowned for his extraordinary memory and for his knowledge of astronomy. He even became known as a painter, and a painting of a landscape around Beijing has recently been attributed to him. By the time he was living in the northern capital, Ricci's skill at Chinese was sufficient to allow him to publish several books in this language. Ricci was not hesitant to challenge the popular opinion in Chinese society, especially among the literati whom he was trying to convert. From the very beginning, however, the Western reception and interpretation of Confucianism was embroiled in theological controversy. In order to win converts to Christianity, he thus advocated a policy of accommodating the Chinese ritual tradition of ancestor worship in the local form of Catholic faith. Allowing Chinese neophytes to continue their practice of Confucian rituals would supposedly have increased the interest of the conservative stratum. Ricci's Dominican and Franciscan opponents, however, strongly opposed such a mixture of what they deemed pagan ritual with Christianity. They maintained that the Chinese Confucians were actually atheistic materialists, who lacked any understanding of the Christian conception of the deity. Although his mission was quite successful, Ricci died in 1610 without ever meeting the emperor. His successors, however, established themselves as the official court astronomers and headed the government engineering bureaus. These positions were generally unaffected by the fall of the Ming dynasty and the founding of the Qing dynasty under the Manchu in 1644. Ricci established friendly relationships which sometimes resulted in the conversion of members of the elite. Xu Guanxi, 1562 to 1633, baptized as Paul in 1603, and lived Cao, 1565 to 1630, baptized as Leo in 1610, are the most famous of Ricci's time. His remarkable fellow Su Guanxi studied further with Ricci in Beijing from 1604 to 1607, and during that time was working with him on the Euclid translation in Chinese. Father Su was also a leading Confucian scholar and official, and was granted the highest honors as a learned man in 1604 at the famous Hanlin Academy in Beijing. Besides his philosophical and theological writings, he wrote a book on geometry, similarity and difference in mensuration. At his death in 1633, he was considered the leading statesman in China after the emperor himself. The first Manchu emperor, in fact, placed his son under the tutelage of the Jesuit fathers, for training in both the physical and moral sciences. This son was to become the Emperor Kangxi, whom Leibniz referred to as a monarch who almost exceeds human heights of greatness, being a godlike mortal, ruling by a nod of his head, who, however, is educated to virtue and wisdom, thereby earning the right to rule. Although brought up by Christian theologians and educated in the spirit of Renaissance science, Kangxi also immersed himself in a study of the Confucian classics, with daily debates over conceptual issues reflected in his diaries. This new learning, erudition and commitment eventually convinced the Chinese literati that they could support Kangxi as emperor, despite his foreign Manchu heritage. Matteo Ricci was a pioneer of cultural relations between China and Europe, and his profound appreciation of Confucian cultural and moral values enabled him to make China known to the West and the West to China. Ricci made his reputation as a scientist of great versatility, and by his display of such novelties as Venetian prisms, European books, paintings and engravings, sundials, clocks, and maps, he attracted a steady audience. The prestige he gained in the highest cultural spheres by his wisdom, scientific knowledge, and capacity for philosophical speculation won him a hearing when he spoke of the gospel message. Without any trace of superiority in his manner, he used a process of dialogue which was characterized by an esteem and respect for everyone. Ricci understood and appreciated Chinese culture fully, did his best to make the developments in European science available for the Chinese, and his example should serve as an inspiration to many. His success was due to his personal qualities, his complete adaptation to Chinese customs, and to his authoritative knowledge of the sciences. He is remembered for his Chinese works on religious and moral topics, as well as on scientific topics such as the astrolabe, sphere, arithmetic, measure and isoperimetric. It is still possible to visit his tomb in the Beijing suburbs. To celebrate the 400th anniversary of Matteo Ricci's arrival in China, the July 1983 issue of an official Chinese magazine from Beijing in English published a warm account of Ricci with numerous photographs of some of his better-known works, which are now in the Beijing Library collection. The 400th anniversary of the death of the Jesuit missionary was celebrated in the previous year, particularly in China, where Ricci's unique approach to the Chinese culture had a tremendous impact.